I mean, botanists can't even agree on how to categorize the varieties that are domesticated for cannabis, and much less, I know there's a debate about whether there actually is any wild cannabis, still in existence or not, but it's kind of hard to argue for given the long history of domestication of cannabis.
Well, this is the thing, and I mean, there's been a pretty persuasive study done by John McPartland, and he's looked at, he did a sort of I think meta study is the word, where he's just collated loads and loads of data from a bunch of different studies on pollen, which have involved looking at pollen. And what he did, because the closest relative to cannabis is the hop, the common hop.
Right.
And
Cumulus, yeah.
Yeah, and their pollen grains are pretty hard to differentiate from each other. So what he did was he did a big study. Based on he differentiated cannabis and hop based on where you tend to find them growing, and hops tend to be associated with forested areas, or the hop rather tends to be associated with forested areas, and then cannabis tends to grow in more arid climates, particularly sort of steppe climates and along the edge of rivers and so on. And he concluded that the most likely place it originated is probably Qinghai, which is up on the Tibetan plateau in sort of western China. Well, Tibet basically, but culturally speaking, but what's now politically part of the PRC. And
right.
So he reckons, well, they reckon rather, scientists reckon about 28 million years ago is probably when cannabis separated from the hop. And yeah, I mean, it's a highly plausible place for it to have originated, because the center of origin of the hop is almost certainly China as well. You've got, I think, 2 or 3 different species of it, one of which is associated with Yunnan, which is just southeast of where McPartland reckons cannabis originated. So, it would work pretty well, because what you have, fast forwarding a few million years, by the time you get to the what they call the axial age, which is really the beginning of what we now think of as civilization, you have this is the era of kind of the Greek philosophers and the Buddha and the beginnings of Chinese civilization. By the time you get to this point, you have a pretty clear differentiation with east and west of Qinghai, right? So west of Qinghai, gotcha. you've got all these finds of Scythian burials, like in Xinjiang, and then up in a little north of Xinjiang in Pazyryk in the Altai, you have these burials of Iranian, I think most likely ethnically Iranian, possibly Indo-European people, but Europoid basically in burials, and then east of Qinghai you've got Han culture, Chinese culture proper kind of forming, and it's pretty clear that the Chinese were not much interested in drug use. By and large, they were interested in fiber, and particularly by the time of the Han Dynasty, they developed paper, whereas the Indo-Europeans and Iranians were clearly much more interested in getting high, and clearly ascribed a lot of significance to it culturally. I mean, they were burying people covered in cannabis plants, like the find in Turpan from a few years ago, which is in Xinjiang. There's I think he appears to be a shaman of some kind, I think, whose burial shroud was covered in cannabis plants. And then all around that area, there are cannabis inflorescences in all of the graves. And then up in the Altai, just north I say just north, I mean hundreds of kilometers north, but
right, yeah.
Within what is clearly the Scythian, what we'd call the Scythian cultural zone, right, which goes from kind of Tuva on the edge of Mongolia is probably where the Scythian culture originated, and then going west from there, you have as I say, the one in Pazyryk, which is literally as well, not literally, but as Herodotus describes in the histories. You have the sort of the censer, the tent rather. You have a tent which underneath which they put a what's the word I'm having a meltdown. But anyway, they've been fumigating basically themselves using cannabis, right? And this is exactly
hotboxing.
Exactly that. Yeah, and this is what and these burial finds date to exactly the era when Herodotus was he sailed north from Athens up to the north coast of the Black Sea, which is the sort of western extremity of the Scythian culture zone, and he described them getting high off cannabis, right? So you have these are all around about 500 BC-ish, which is this really crucial point in human history, and then you have another one on the western edge of Xinjiang.